Hello. Okay. So apologies, the lecture is not in person this week, which is due to the fact that I had a very serious family health emergency last week, which is not yet entirely resolved, but is hopefully moving in the right direction. So I'm going to be live streaming last week's lecture right now, and then the final lecture will be at the usual time and place in person this week. And as usual, if people want to come to my office to talk about it afterwards, they can do so. So I'm live streaming this from my YouTube channel in the absence of better technological skills. So I guess other people can see it, which I don't use my YouTube channel very much, but maybe I'll start using it a bit more. In any case, so we have the first half of the course. You're looking mainly at dualism and causal closure problems. Apologies for the sellotape glasses that I recently snapped, and I'm running out of contact lenses. Need to wait for new glasses that I've ordered to arrive. But anyway, so we looked in the first half of the course, dualism and causal closure worries. Second half of this term, rather, not the course, this term, we're looking at arguments against physicalism and panpsychism. So we have, in terms of arguments against physicalism, we had a week on the knowledge argument and the zombie argument, introducing the simplified form of it we find in my book Galileo's Error. Then we spent a week looking at the most popular physicalist response. This week we'll look at the anti-physicalist response, some of the ways in which anti-physicalists respond and try and rehabilitate those arguments. And then you'll have hopefully a good overview of the entire debate. Okay, so just finishing off the last lecture on physicalism first with a little bit of taxonomy here. Let me know, people, if you can't hear me or can't see me or anything. So you might be wondering, well, what do these arguments, we looked at two arguments, the knowledge argument and the zombie argument, what do they have to do with each other? Well, arguably, they are essentially two ways of trying to do the same thing. Thanks, John, for letting me know you can hear me. Good to see you. At the very least, they have a common two-stage structure. So in the first stage, they try to establish an epistemological gap of some kind between the physical facts and the consciousness facts. So epistemological, obviously, being to do with what we can know or how we can know things. So in the knowledge argument, they try to establish really that you, just from the physical facts, you can't work out what it's like to see red. The zombie argument tries to show that zombies are logically possible in the sense that you can't rule them out a priori. So that's a sort of epistemological fact to do with how we can know about things. And then in the second stage, they try to infer from the epistemological gap to a metaphysical gap. Ultimately, that the physical facts alone do not necessitate the consciousness facts. The physicalism is false. So these are these two different crucial parts of the argument. And depending how the physicalist responds, which of these they deny, leads to two very different kinds of physicalism. A priori physicalists and a posteriori physicalists, or what Chalmers calls, let me shut my emails that are bleeping there. Chalmers calls these type A physicalists and type B physicalists. In his big paper about this whole debate, that's very good, Consciousness and its Place in Nature, he tries to lay out all the options on consciousness, A, B, C, D, E, F. So the a priori physicalists are the more radical, less common, although still eminently respectable option, tries to deny that there's even an epistemological gap. So deny the argument from the very start. Zombies are not even logically possible. Mary would gain no new propositional knowledge. Maybe she wouldn't gain any new knowledge at all, or maybe she'd gain knowledge in a sort of looser sense, maybe know how certain abilities or knowledge by acquaintance. Whereas a posteriori physicalists, which for what it's worth is the more popular option, I think, roughly since the 1990s, which we were focusing on last week, is to accept the epistemic gap but deny the inference to a metaphysical conclusion. So zombies are logically possible, or zombies are logically possible but not metaphysically possible. Mary gains new knowledge, but new knowledge of an old fact, of a fact she already knew about, and we've looked at both of those last lecture. So we are so we're going to focus mainly on the debate with the a posteriori physicalist. As I say, that's the more common dominant response, although in the rest of the slides of this physicalism in depth PowerPoint, there are some responses from a priori physicalists to the knowledge argument, so you can have a look at them if you wish. All right, but let's move on. Okay, so let's move on to anti-physicalists strike back. How do the anti-physicalists respond to this? Somebody who's not my student, Digital Gnosis, a friend of mine, is being silly in the comments, but you can ignore that. I might block him if he carries on being a pest. Okay, so as we looked at in great detail last lecture, the core of the right, one more comment and I'm going to block you. The core of the physicalist, the a posteriori physicalist response to zombie and knowledge arguments is to distinguish another form of possibility. So, and as we discussed, they draw heavily from Saul Kripke's influential work in Naming and Necessity. Right, so perhaps before Kripke, philosophers might have thought, well, we're mainly dealing with two kinds of possibility: nomological possibility, what's consistent with the laws of nature, and logical possibility, what can't be ruled out a priori. Kripke then pushes influentially that there's a third kind of possibility in between these two, metaphysical possibility, which is a metaphysical notion of possibility, not epistemic. It's supposed to be a notion of how things could have been, but it's not definitionally tied to the laws of nature. So we're also considering possible universes with very different laws of nature. So to illustrate this, as this is all just a bit of recap, we looked at, for example, what we say about the possibility of water being a fundamental element, as the ancient Greeks believed. So this is not exactly an example Kripke deals with, but it's very much illustrates his point. Kripke would say this is logically possible. We can't rule it out a priori, but it's metaphysically impossible because water, we've discovered scientifically that water just is essentially H2O, and therefore it's H2O in every possible universe, whatever the laws of nature, and therefore there's no possible universe in which water is metaphysically fundamental. Okay, and then they want to say that they want to use this to this new kind of possibility to diffuse the zombie and knowledge arguments. So in terms of the zombie argument, this is all recap. They might deny premise 2 here, that if feelings are identical with brain states, then it's not logically possible for feelings to exist without brain states. Zombies are logically impossible. A posteriori physicists will deny this premise. They will say, well, this premise is true if we're dealing with metaphysical possibility, but not if we're dealing with logical possibility. Okay, so the core of the response is to distinguish between logical possibility and metaphysical possibility, right? Try and thereby argue, okay, zombies are logically possible, but they're not genuinely metaphysically possible, and therefore physicalism can still be true. How do anti-physicalists, now moving on to this week's lecture, how do anti-physicalists respond to this? I mean, I suppose they could, in principle, just totally deny this distinction between logical and metaphysical possibility. That is what some people are inclined to do. In the lecture last week, some students were sort of inclined in that direction. But as I said, and that's a perfectly respectable thing to try and do that you might want to try and do in an essay or exam. But as I said, for what it's worth, Kripke has been incredibly influential, and in fact, both sides of this dispute in general want to concede a lot to Kripke and want to indeed draw on his work in bolstering their position. So the more common response would be to say, yeah, okay, Kripke got something right, that metaphysical and logical possibility can come apart, but only in certain cases, right? They want to identify exactly when they come apart and thereby formulate a sort of nuanced principle about in which cases logical and metaphysical possibility go together, right? I put epistemological there. I'm just using that to mean logical possibility. Okay, so there are maybe a couple of different ways of doing this. David Chalmers does it in terms of his very complicated two-dimensional semantic framework. When I first started teaching this stuff, I used to teach all that, but I've kind of given up on that, at least in the time constraints of the course. It is a little bit complicated, a little bit of a struggle to get a grip on. Even professional philosophers struggle with it a little bit sometimes. David Papineau thanks me in one of his papers for helping him understand it. It's a little bit complicated. Maybe you can get some extra brownie points if you want to try and get to grips with David Chalmers' two-dimensional semantic framework. Happy to meet and talk to anyone about that if they'd like to. Although if you're going to do that, obviously you want to make sure you're getting it right. So maybe a little bit of a more high-risk, high-reward strategy. I try to explain it in quite an accessible way in my book, Consciousness and Fundamental Reality. Also, Papineau and I co-wrote a paper called something like What's Wrong with Strong Necessities, where we try to explain Chalmers' stuff in a more accessible way. Or Chalmers' classic paper on this is The Two-Dimensional Argument Against Materialism, if you want to go straight for the core reading. Okay, but myself and Martina Niederrummelen, who's a very good German substance dualist, have a slightly different and I think a little bit easier, I hope, way of doing this. So I'm mainly going to focus on that. I've been a bit lazy here writing Martina's name there. Rummelen should have an umlaut, I think it's called, isn't it? Over the U, 2 dots. Okay, so what we say is that logical possibility and metaphysical possibility stay together when we're dealing with transparent concepts. Okay, so our first question is going to be, what are transparent concepts? Okay, so Martina and I, well, we came up with this. It's not like work we've done together. We came up with this independently. I should say she came up with it first in a paper in 2007 in a volume on phenomenal concepts and phenomenal knowledge by Torren Alter and I can't remember the co-editor now, Walter. And but we came up with it independently, and then it was converging on the truth. No, it wasn't. That's what I'd say. That's what we'd say. But obviously, many people dispute it. But okay, here's the base. This is my terminology for putting it. She has slightly different terminology. This crucial distinction between transparent and opaque concepts. So a concept is transparent if and only if, IFF there means if and only if, it reveals the essence of its referent. That is to say, you can know a priori what the referent essentially is. So hopefully this is a bit clearer with an example. So take a triangle, right? The property of being a triangle. What is a triangle? A triangle is essentially something with 3 sides, right? That's what a triangle essentially is. And you can know that. You can know what a triangle essentially is just through sitting and reasoning, right? You don't need to go out and do any science. Whereas a concept is opaque, the opposite, if and only if it doesn't reveal the essence of its referent. So take the concept of water, right? What is water? Water is essentially H2O, But you can't know that just through sitting in an armchair reasoning with the concept. You have to go out and do some science, right? So in that sense, the concept alone doesn't reveal the essence. So we say it's opaque. Maybe you disagree with those examples, but I hope they nonetheless illustrate the point. Okay, so that's our distinction. I mean, there's more nuance and categories in between and so on if you dig deeper into this, but that's the basic distinction. Okay, and then, so this is what we're doing in terms of this. We're trying to identify when logical possibility and metaphysical possibility come apart and when they don't. And so in trying to do this, we defend what I've called, in a paper with the same title, essentialist modal rationalism, a view called essentialist modal rationalism. So modal means to do with possibility. Rationalism means the view that you can have some substantive knowledge through reason, and essentialist meaning to do with essences. So the basic idea here is that if your conception of something involves only transparent concepts, then logical possibility and metaphysical possibility always stay together. That's the basic idea. If our conception of something involves only transparent concepts, then logical possibility and metaphysical possibility always go together, right? So just to try and illustrate this with an example, going back to our example we've been working with, water being a fundamental element, right? This is Kripke would hold, and most people in this debate agree with him, that this is logically but not metaphysically possible, right? Logically but not metaphysically possible. Why is that? Well, the thought is that the reason logical and metaphysical possibility can come apart here is because with the concept water, one of the concepts involved in our conceiving here is an opaque concept. It doesn't reveal to you what water essentially is. It doesn't reveal the essence of water as H2O. And so because of that, it's thereby conceivable that that water isn't H2O, right? Right? It's because the concept doesn't reveal that water is essentially H2O that you don't know that that's not apparent in your conception. And so your conception leaves open that maybe water could be a fundamental element, right? So that's the claim. It's when you're dealing with opaque concepts that you get this gap opening up between logical and metaphysical possibility. But the thought is that gap closes when we're just dealing with transparent concepts. So take an example, for example, considering the possibility of there being a million-sided object. Well, here, plausibly, the concepts, all the concepts involved are transparent, like the concept of being million-sided. You know a priori what it is for something to be million-sided. I would say perhaps you know a priori what it is for something to be an object, if by an object you just mean something that exists. So these are transparent concepts. So all the concepts involved in our conception here are transparent. And so the claim is here, logical possibility entails metaphysical possibility. So it seems logically possible that there could be a million-sided object. There's nothing to rule it out just through reasoning. And we can thereby infer that it's metaphysically possible because all of the concepts in our conception of it are transparent. Okay, that's the basic idea. So we've accepted, yeah, Kripke, you're right. Sometimes logical and metaphysical possibility come apart, but we've diagnosed when they come apart, and in diagnosing when they come apart, we can identify when they don't come apart, and so we can identify those situations where logical and metaphysical possibility stay together. Okay, well, if we're going to save the zombie and knowledge arguments, there's something else here we're going to have to defend. namely that there are concepts of conscious experience, which, as we've discussed, philosophers call phenomenal concepts, are transparent. If you can't quite see yet why this is also going to be necessary, don't worry, we'll bring it all together on the next slide. But I'll just introduce the idea here of what we can call phenomenal transparency, the view that phenomenal concepts are transparent. So phenomenal concepts, recall, are just our paradigm concepts of conscious experience that you form when you attend to your experience and think about it in terms of what it's like or how it feels. So I'm in pain, I attend to my pain and I think about it in terms of how it feels, I thereby form a phenomenal concept of my pain. This is a term originally from David Chalmers, but which has become quite ubiquitous in these discussions. So, okay, so I'll tell you what me and Niederrummelen. Actually, I think I just put Rummelen earlier, didn't I? Rummelen. It's Niederrummelen. Her brother actually apparently was quite a famous German politician, but maybe you won't have heard of him from a generation or so ago, I think. But she works at a Swiss-German university, University of Fribourg. Oh, no, it was a French-German. French-Swiss university. Anyway. So anyway, how Martina and I think about this. So we think the concept of the phenomenal concept of pain is transparent. It reveals the essence of pain. Okay, so let me just, we've both got arguments for this, but let me just try and put the case in a very intuitive way. Right, we think of pain in terms of how it feels, right? But pain is essentially defined by how it feels, right? A pain, by definition, is just a feeling. A feeling is essentially defined by how it feels. And when you attend to your pain and think about it as pain, you have access to how it feels. So you have access to what essentially defines it. Okay, well, that's the basic, trying to make the claim here very intuitive. Maybe you dispute this, but that's the basic idea. But it's not entirely controversial. So, for example, this is denied by physicalists like David Papineau, at least in some papers. Maybe he's changed his mind a little bit later, or Brian Laughlin. So they think basically, when we think about our conscious experiences, we do so by the fact that we've just evolved a kind of capacity to just sort of point at something within ourselves, but without having any access to its essential nature. So so when you're thinking about your pain, that terrible pain, you're just sort of pointing inside yourself, as it were. You don't know what the hell it is. Turns out, for the physicalist, it's a brain state you're pointing at, but just from introspection, you don't know that. You're just sort of pointing at something. Okay, so phenomenal concepts for them turn out to be opaque. Okay, so, but Martina and I try to defend the idea that they are transparent. So, the question is here, right? Earlier we said it's plausible that concept of a triangle is transparent, just through reasoning what a triangle essentially is. Concept of water is opaque. You have to do some science to find out what water essentially is. So I suppose the question is, think about the concept of pain. Is it more like the concept of a triangle, or is it more like the concept of water? In this specific sense, that you can know what pain essentially is just through attending to your pain? Or do you have to do some science to work out what pain essentially is? So Martina and I think the former. You know what pain is just through attending to your pain. And you can already see it. If we're right about that, then that makes it very different to other kinds of scientific identities, like water being H2O, heat being molecular motion, lightning being electric discharge, right? You have to do some science to work out what all these things essentially are. You can't know just through reasoning what water is or what lightning is. But if we're right, before you do any science, you know what pain essentially is, because it's a feeling. It's defined by how it feels, and you have access to how it feels. Then already that makes it quite different to other scientific identities, and this builds on other stuff Kripke says in Naming and Necessity that you might want to check out. Some extra brownie points. You can read Naming and Necessity yourself. Got a comment here, Mark O'Brien. Is it plausible that there's a spectrum between transparent and opaque? Maybe opaque concepts are the ones where it is really hard to see that it's logically possible, impossible. Well, we are going to get to a bit more nuance presently. That's a very good question. Yeah, I mean, I've just given you the basic contrast between the two extremes, transparent and opaque. So I think, for students as well, that's going to be like a good place to push. If you look in my book, Consciousness and Fundamental Reality, there are more distinctions, on my paper, Essentialist Modal Rationalism. But I'll hint at a little bit about that towards the end. Okay, so let's start to bring all this together. So we can get to now a more sophisticated version of the zombie argument. So Galileo's error gives a kind of simplified version of the zombie argument. We've seen the kind of physicalist response to that. Here's a more sophisticated version that isn't just assuming, that logical and metaphysical possibility always go together. The conceivability entails genuine possibility, but is trying to identify, as I say, this limited range of cases where they do. Okay, so it go like this, right? Zombies are logically possible. That's something that's a premise that's common with anti-physicalist and a posteriori physicalist. They both accept that. Premise 2, essentialist modal rationalism, that if your conception of something involves only transparent concepts, then logical possibility equals metaphysical possibility. Premise 3, conceiving of zombies involves, I guess you could perhaps put an only there, only physical and phenomenal concepts. So the idea would be, how do we conceive of a zombie? Well, you conceive of something physically identical to you. So you're employing physical concepts then. And then you say, and it's not conscious. So when you say it's not conscious, you're sort of using a phenomenal concept, a concept of consciousness, and you're sort of adding a negation sign at the beginning, a negation operator, saying it's not that. Okay, then premise 4, physical and phenomenal concepts are transparent. We just looked at the idea that phenomenal concepts are transparent. You might be thinking, what about physical concepts? Are physical concepts transparent? Well, we'll come back to that in a moment, but I suppose you might intuitively press the idea that they are, because these are just the concepts involved in physical science. And if you know enough physical science, then you know what is essentially being ascribed to reality by these concepts and theories, what mass, spin, and charge are, and so on. So you might think for that reason, physical concepts are transparent because they're just the concepts in physical science, and if you know enough physical science, you know what they're ascribing to reality. Okay, so if all of that is correct, we can logically infer that zombies are metaphysically possible, right? Because conceiving of them involves only these transparent concepts, i.e. physical and phenomenal concepts. Then essentialist modal rationalism tells us, well, in those cases where we're just dealing with transparent concepts, logical and metaphysical possibility go together. Therefore, we can infer from the logical possibility to the metaphysical possibility. And then for the familiar reasons from the zombie argument we looked at on the first lecture on physicalism, if zombies are metaphysically possible, then physicalism is false. Therefore, physicalism is false. Okay, so that would be a more sophisticated way of defending the zombie argument. Okay, how would this apply to the knowledge argument? And I'll stop to see if any questions in a moment. I don't know if any students are watching it live, but we'll see. So recall both anti-physicalists. So anti-physicalists and a posteriori physicalists or phenomenal concept strategy people, they both have this common starting point, right? They both have a common starting point. In the case of the zombie argument, it's that zombies are logically possible. In the case of the knowledge argument, it's that Murray gains a new concept, right? So they agree. So the a posteriori physicalist says, wait, what Mary gains when she comes out of her room is a new way of thinking about red experiences. Now she can think of them as red experiences. She can think about them under a phenomenal concept, right? She can think about them under a phenomenal concept, right? So the phenomenal concepts are funny kinds of concept that you can only employ if you have the corresponding experience, right? If you can't, a blind from birth person can't employ a phenomenal concept of red experiences, because you have to actually have a red experience to have that concept. Okay, so both sides of this dispute accept that Mary gains a new concept. Okay, but to my mind, and I think Martina would say the same, what we can do with this depends on whether that new concept is opaque or transparent, right? If the concept is opaque, then there's going to be no threat to physicalism, right? Because Mary's new concept could just refer to a physical property, a certain brain state, right? If the concept doesn't reveal what it refers to, it could just refer to a physical brain state, right? So she gains a new concept, but so what? It's just a new concept that refers to a physical property. Physicalism is saved. But if the new concept is transparent, then it reveals to her something about the essential nature of red experiences, right? Something she didn't know in her black and white room, something she couldn't learn from physical science. And therefore, it seems to follow that there's something about the essential nature of red experiences that she couldn't know just from physical science, right? So in my view, for what it's worth, I think the knowledge argument alone only establishes that Mary gains a new concept, but that if you can conjoin that with phenomenal transparency, the view that phenomenal concepts are transparent, we therefore have a good case against physicalism. Okay, as a reminder, as always, you don't gain or lose marks for agreeing or disagreeing with me. It's on the character of your argument. Okay, this is all getting a little bit complicated because we're now, reaching the cutting edge of the argument. We introduced it in very simple terms. People who are just tuning in on my YouTube channel probably might find this obviously quite challenging material, I think. But that's because we're reaching the cutting edge of the argument. Okay, so that's roughly how anti-physicalists, in broad brushstrokes, respond to these arguments. Now, you might think, okay, if I'm just leaving you there's a bit of bias ending with my perspective on this topic. So let me just very finally, before we move on to panpsychism, before we finish the physicalism topic, just gesture at how physicalists counter respond. So here at this stage, we're really getting into the weeds. We're getting to the counter responses, right? We had the initial zombie argument and knowledge argument. Then we had the physicalist response. Then we had the anti-physicalist counter response. Now we're looking at the counter response, right? So I'm just going to give an overview. You can pursue this in your own thought and research. So basically there are two crucial parts, as we've looked at, to this more sophisticated zombie argument. Let's just focus on the zombie argument, but all of these points would apply in a slightly different way to the knowledge argument. One crucial part of this is arguing for this essentialist modal rationalism, that when we're dealing with transparent concepts, logical and metaphysical possibility always go together. The other claim is that phenomenal concepts are themselves transparent. You need both, right? It's no good having the essential modal rationalism if phenomenal concepts are not transparent, because then, so you've established that when in cases where there's only transparent concepts, logical and metaphysical possibility go together. But if phenomenal concepts aren't transparent, then in the zombie case, we're still going to get the divergence between logical and metaphysical possibility that the a posteriori physicalist wants to push. Okay, so these two crucial premises in the argument, the truth of essentialist modal rationalism and the claim that phenomenal concepts are transparent. So really, the the a posteriori physicalist can deny one of these or the other, or both, right? So just in terms of denying essentialist modal rationalism, the physicalist might just still argue that logical and metaphysical possibility are just totally different things, right? They might press, as came up in the last lecture, well, look, logical possibility is defined in sort of epistemological terms to do with what we can know a priori. Metaphysical possibility is defined in terms of something metaphysical, right? So they're just, why should you think there's any kind of connection? David Papineau, I referred to our co-written paper before, What's Wrong with Strong Necessities. There in the first bit of it, I think it might be the world's only forking philosophy paper. So the first third we slag off Chalmers. Then I was very pleased doing my PhD that I worked out I disagreed with David Chalmers on something. So obviously the key anti-physicalist. So then I had something to say. Anyway, so the first third of this paper we slag off Chalmers, and then I go on to defend sort of this essentialist modal rationalism, and Chalmers goes on to Papineau goes on to say, well, look, I just don't think, I have a more radical position. I just don't think logical and metaphysical possibility have anything to do with each other. Or conceivability and possibility. As we've noted, conceivability is the term often used for logical possibility. I don't really like that term, but it is common. An alternative possibility is, sorry I keep blocking you, Nathan, but you just keep sort of filling the comments up, and this is an academic exercise, but if you behave yourself, I will not block you. You're happy to raise objections, but it's just sort of one after another is sort of a little bit not ideal in this context. Okay, so another possibility is to say both physical and phenomenal concepts are transparent to concede that, to accept that, but nonetheless to say you could still have a physical phenomenal identity. Henry Taylor, a former PhD student at Durham, now an associate professor at Birmingham, has defended this approach. The next possibility, okay, you might accept essentialist modal rationalism, but deny that phenomenal concepts are transparent. I already pointed to David Papineau and Brian McLaughlin, who think that they're just opaque, or at least in some papers have argued that they're just opaque. But there's also another option here, right? As I said, I gave these polar opposites of either transparent or opaque, but you might think there's an in-between here. Maybe there could be concepts that reveal something, but not everything of the essence of the referent, right? So maybe phenomenal concepts reveal something of what pain essentially is, but not everything. And the technical term for this that I came up with is translucent, right? Like sort of partially see-through. So on this view, phenomenal concepts are translucent. They reveal something, but not everything of the essence of conscious states. So maybe that can be made sense of. All of these options I deal with in my academic book, Consciousness and Fundamental Reality. All of these physical options. You can check out the references there or in the reading list. Dig deeper into these possibilities. Now, you might think, I'll stop for comments and questions in a moment. You might think, well, what about something we flagged up earlier? What about physical concepts not being transparent? Okay, because zombies, in the zombie conception, you have both phenomenal and physical concepts. Maybe the physical concepts don't reveal the essence of their reference. Now, perhaps that is an option. I would say most people were talking on these debates on either side think that sort of collapses into the panpsychist option, right? Because that's kind of what panpsychists say, right? They say there's just the physical, but physical science doesn't reveal to us the essence of the physical, right? Physical science just gives us its sort of mathematical structure. It doesn't reveal the essence of particles, fields, mass, spin, and charge. So most people think that sort of collapses into the Russellian panpsychist option or something similar. But maybe you disagree. Perhaps that is another option. Okay, so that's all on physicalism. Let's have a couple of comments. If there are any students here with comments, put up student, put it up. But go on, Nathan. I'll give you a question, seeing as you've come back with a third account. Imagine which one do we want to go for here? Imagine a physicalist who thinks mental states are brain states. They would say mental states are opaque because you can be in pain without knowing what physical state your brain is. Whereas a qualia freak, I guess that's the name for an anti-physicalist, sometimes a friendly term of abuse for anti-physicalists, might say that to be in pain is to grasp the essential nature of pain. So all the content involved in phenomenal experiences gives you some further information. Well, yeah, I think that's a correct way of putting up the different positions. But so what? I guess, are you saying maybe this is sort of question begging, that nobody would say, would deny, a physicalist is just going to say phenomenal concepts are opaque. It's part of the definition of the position. So as soon as you deny that, you're sort of begging the question. I mean, if that's what you're saying, I think that belies the fact that many physicalists don't think phenomenal concepts are opaque, right? So, for example, Henry Taylor, who I refer to on this slide, thinks phenomenal concepts are transparent. The concept of pain does reveal the essence of pain. So does the physical concept, but nonetheless, physicalism can be true. These are very different ways of conceiving of the essence of a single property. So Nick Daimanovich as well also holds that view. So, and also another option, so sort of more moderate response is to deny they're opaque, but to hold that they're translucent. So there are a variety of options here. Oh, okay. Sorry, Nathan, you're saying you were just replying for what someone said. Sorry, I thought that was an objection. Okay, so much for physicalism. Well, in the last 5 minutes or so, we will go back to the topic of panpsychism. So we've we introduced the anti-physicalist arguments. Hold on, in the argument a few slides ago, do you think the premises are more probable than the conclusion, or has the conclusion driven you to reflect on modality, etc., and hold the premises? Perhaps also suspicions is sort of assuming what it's trying to prove. I guess I do think the premises are very plausible. Yeah, I do think it's plausible. A good understanding of Kripke, that logical possibility and I think we've got a good diagnosis with this essentialist modal rationalism. We've got a good diagnosis of why metaphysical and logical possibility come apart. So I think it is independently plausible, and yeah, I do think it's. I personally think it's pre-theoretically pretty plausible that phenomenal concepts are transparent. That, and this is again sort of in Kripke. Kripke says, with water, I mean, this is how Kripke puts it, right? With water, the way we pick it out, its appearance is different from the reality, right? The appearance of water is this, colorless, odorless, fills oceans and lakes and so on. Whereas the essence of water is this scientifically discovered thing that you can't know just through your basic senses, being H2O. So appearance and reality come apart in some way. But Kripke says, well, what's the appearance of pain? It's how it feels. But pain just is a feeling. It's defined by how it feels. So appearance and reality can't come apart in the same way. Okay, so anyway, obviously big discussion here. Thanks very much, Nathan. Happy to continue the discussion, but we better move on to now. But for now, so okay, so we'll just we introduced physicalism and dug deeper. We started off this half of the term that I've taught, introducing physicalism in one lecture, introducing the basic idea of panpsychism. Then we've dug deeper with physicalism. Now we're gonna dig deeper with panpsychism. We'll just start that a little bit now and carry that on for the next lecture this Thursday. Okay, so recap, the case for panpsychism is that it supposedly avoids both the deep problems facing physicalism or materialism and the deep problems facing dualism. So the problems facing physicalism allegedly are the knowledge and zombie arguments. The problems facing dualism are these causal closure arguments. Panpsychism promises to avoid both of these. Unfortunately, at least in its reductive panpsychist form that we looked at when we introduced panpsychism, seem to face deep problems of their own. And that's what we're going to close with. So what's standardly seen as the big problem, the big challenge to panpsychism is what has become known as the combination problem. And this is defined in subtly different ways, but the basic idea is, how do we make sense of little conscious things, conscious particles or conscious fields coming together to make the unified consciousness of the human or animal brain, right? So panpsychists, let's say, want to attribute very rudimentary forms of consciousness at the level of fundamental physics. And then the idea is these combine in complex forms to form the complex consciousness of the human or animal brain. And the basic challenge is, how the hell do you make sense of that, right? We seem to be able to make sense of how bricks make up a house, or how mechanical parts make up a car engine, but we're at a loss to make sense of how little conscious minds combine to make a big conscious mind. It's at least something we struggle to make intelligible sense of. Some have argued that it doesn't make intelligible sense. A little bit of technical vocabulary here. We can talk about the micro as opposed to the micro-phenomenal facts as opposed to the macro-phenomenal facts. So micro-phenomenal facts are the putative forms of consciousness we find at the level of fundamental physics, according to panpsychism, at the micro level. Macro-phenomenal are facts about consciousness of the more familiar kind that we find in the biological world, such as of humans and other animals. So we can put it by saying, how do micro-phenomenal facts give rise to macro-phenomenal facts? My child's making noises outside the door. Hopefully you can't hear that. So often inspiration from this is drawn from the great 19th century philosopher and psychologist William James, who went back and forth on panpsychism. He was sort of into it, but he struggled with these kind of worries. The term combination problem comes from William Seeger, very good Canadian philosopher who's attracted to panpsychism. But often inspiration comes back to this famous passage from William James, where he says, take 100 feelings, shuffle them and pack them close together as you can, whatever that may mean. Still, each remains the same feeling it always was, shut in its own skin, windowless, ignorant of what the other feelings are and mean. There could be 101st feeling there if, when a group or series of such feelings were set up, a consciousness belonging to the group as such should emerge. And this 101st feeling would be a totally new fact. The 100 feelings may, by a curious physical law, be a signal for its creation when they came together, but they would have no substantial identity with it, nor it with them, and one could never deduce the one from the other, nor in any intelligible sense say they evolved it. He goes on to say, give a different way of pushing the point. Take a sentence of 12 words and take 12 men and tell to each one word. Then stand the men in a row and jam them in a bunch and let them think of each of his word as intently as he will. Nowhere will there be a consciousness of the whole sentence. We talk of the spirit of the age and the sentiment of the people, and in various ways we hypostatize public opinion, quote unquote. But we know this to be symbolic speech, and never dream that the sentiment opinions spirit, opinion, sentiment, etc., constitute a consciousness other than and additional to that of the several individuals whom the words age, people, and public denote. The private minds do not agglomerate into a higher compound mind. So I guess this is very intuitive and not really much of a sort of substantive argument, but it seems to resonate with a lot of people that there's something hard to make sense of here. So that's the brute intuition that we can start with, but there are many ways of drilling this down into a more concrete, well worked out challenge to the panpsychist position. And some people even try to press that this challenge is just as deep as the problems facing the physicalism or dualism, right? And so panpsychism's really got us nowhere, right? Supposed to promise everything, promise the moon on a stick, avoid these deep problems, but the problem it ends up facing is just the same. So we've got nowhere. Anyway, obviously panpsychists like myself would try to resist that. So we'll finish next lecture by digging a little bit deeper into some more concrete ways of putting the combination problem, ways people respond to that, counter responses, and so on. And maybe if we've got time, look at some other theories of consciousness. If anyone's just tuning in who's not a student of this course, this would have been a little bit challenging maybe because it's the sort of climax of the course. I might use my YouTube channel a bit more to do some other stuff. But okay, well, thanks everyone for listening, and see my students on Thursday. See the rest of you maybe if I use my YouTube channel a bit more. But thank you very much. Let's leave it there. Bye-bye.